it's important that we remember days like today. That was a day that we saw really the best of America. And for those of you who remember that day, I'm looking now over at students, some of our grad students, and I'm thinking some of you were maybe not even born. And yet here they are coming to us at the Graduate Policy School thinking about careers in which they are responding to those events, whether they live through them directly or not. That is definitely a part of this unique graduate program here, is that we understand the importance of history and at the same time the importance of the American experiment and defending it around the world. That is particularly true of today and our Constitution Day celebration, luncheon here, and with our lecturer for the day, Rabbi Dr. Stuart Halpern. Rabbi Dr. Halpern is a senior advisor to the provost at Yeshiva University, but he is also the program director of a particularly important and mission-aligned academic unit at Yeshiva University called the Straus Center for Torah and Western Thought. As a graduate program that takes really seriously the importance of the great books and the Western canon and melding that with a quantitative set of courses and curriculum that prepare public leaders to not only think about public policy from an analytical standpoint, but also from a historical and philosophical standpoint. The work that Rabbi Dr. Halpern is doing there at Yeshiva University is really so important. He is the author and editor of 17 books, and one of those we'll be talking about specifically today is his latest, The Promise of Liberty. As he will no doubt explain, the way this cover has been set up with the spine on this side was done intentionally. This was not a mistake by the book printers, and we'll learn so much more. This relationship that we celebrate today is really one of an ongoing relationship with the Straus Center. And we've had Rabbi Dr. Halpern here and other scholars from that institute at Yeshiva University in New York. And it's really part of our broader vision for the School of Public Policy that we be seen more as a bicoastal program with relationships not only here in California, but in New York and Washington, D.C. as well. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming our 2024 Constitution Day lecturer, Rabbi Dr. Stuart Halpern.
Thank you so much for having me. And yes, as Dean Peterson noted, this is actually a Hebrew book. It's a Passover Haggadah, so it opens like a Hebrew book, i.e. the opposite way. So don't be confused that it is the world's worst typo ever. It is not. This is how it's meant to open. A few years ago, a best-selling book proclaimed that one could learn the history of the world in 6 classes. A few decades before that, President FDR articulated what became known as the 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear in a State of the Union address in 1941. Well, today I want to talk about the 4 glasses, or the 4 cups, that we Jews drink from, 4 cups of wine at the Passover Seder. Why? At that evening celebration, the commemoration, of course, of the Exodus from Egypt as described in the Bible, we drink 4 cups, each commemorating a certain biblical expression. And what I want to argue today is that each of these biblical expressions actually provides a theme in the American story, specifically how the Exodus inspired that American story. So we're going to trace how, and yes, this was generated by ChatGPT, Moses eventually becomes an analog for President Washington. But let's begin first in the city of brotherly love. In Philadelphia, a few years ago, local news got very excited. Why? Because there was a Sphinx that was placed, or that was moved to the lobby of the Penn Museum. Now that Sphinx was of none other than Pharaoh Ramses II, who is the bad guy in what story? The story of the Exodus, of course. But seemingly completely ignorant of this fact, the museum director a fellow by the name of Julian Siggers was very excited, and he told reporters that the Sphinx of Ramses II was so heavy it weighed about 25,000 pounds. So what's the equivalent of that? Well, he said that's about 12 Liberty Bells, 87 Philadelphia Fanatics, that's the mascot of the Phillies, and 64,000 cheesesteaks. Now, what's a little bit surprising about evoking the Liberty Bell in the context of mentioning Pharaoh Ramses II? Well, when the Israelites were freed from his clutches, they were told that thou shalt proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof, which is a biblical verse inscribed on the Liberty Bell. So he was maybe a little bit ignorant of this fact, more than a little ironic that he mentioned the Liberty Bell in the context of Pharaoh Ramses II. So I want to go through with you, how was that in exiting from the clutches of that tyrannical monarch, the American story itself was forged. So first, the biblical verse. Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 and 7 have the following told by God to Moses. Wherefore say unto the children of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out. That's expression number 1, inspiring the first cup of the Passover Seder, the Passover meal. From under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you. Expression number 2, out of their bondage. And I will redeem you with a stretched out arm and with great judgments, and I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. These are known in the Jewish tradition as the 4 expressions of redemption or liberty. Well, expression number 1 inspired none other than the Pilgrims and the Puritans. I will bring you out, the flight from persecution. Aboard the Mayflower in 1620, the Pilgrim leader William Bradford kept a diary. And in that diary, he described their journey away from persecution as follows. He wrote, quote, our fathers were Englishmen which came over this ocean and were ready to perish in this wilderness. But they cried unto the Lord, and he heard their voice and looked on their adversity. Let them therefore praise the Lord, because he is good, and his mercies endure forever. He's essentially paraphrasing and citing chapter and verse of the description of the Israelites as they left Egypt. And he continued, yea, let them which have been redeemed of the Lord show how he hath delivered them from the hand of the oppressor. Oppressor, of course, being Pharaoh Ramses II, when they wandered in the desert wilderness out of the way, describing the wanderings for 40 years of the Jews in the desert. Now, as a fascinating footnote to this journal entry that shaped the first Americans arriving on our shores as seeing their own journey as that of being like or a new iteration of biblical Israel, a scholar by the name of Nick Bunker points out that the Bible used by Bradford actually had a footnote in it. And in that footnote, it described how, per the Jewish tradition in a law codified by the great theologian Maimonides, who I'm sure we're all familiar with, Maimonides mentioned that, as the Talmud, the Code of Jewish Law, the Compendium of Jewish Law describes, when a Jewish person survives an arduous journey and makes it through the other side, you're actually supposed to express gratitude to God. The manifestation of this is called in Hebrew Birkat HaGomel. It's a blessing of survival. And so suggests Nick Bunker that the very first Thanksgiving was actually this expression of Bradford, this citation of the Bible, expressing gratitude to God for safe passage, just like that of biblical Israel escaping from the clutches of Pharaoh. And that itself was the first expression of what became known as the American Thanksgiving. It was fulfillment of this Jewish practice of expressing gratitude to God after making it through the other side of an arduous journey. It wasn't only Bradford that described or that saw his journey as that of biblical Israel fleeing successfully. 130 years prior, Christopher Columbus had written in his diary about how him and his crew faced the rising of the sea, which was very formidable to me, as it happened formerly to Moses when he led the Jews from Egypt. And Bradford, as we mentioned, described his journey as, quote, Moses and the Israelites when they went out of Egypt. A few years later, John Winthrop, one of the Puritan founders of Massachusetts Bay Colony, compared his departure for New England to how the Lord, quote, carried the Israelites into the wilderness and made them forget the flesh pots of Egypt. Expression number 2, and I will deliver you. The American Israelites versus the British Egyptians. Well, the role of the head bad guy of Ramses II as Americans continue to see their story as that of ancient Israel, became embodied by the evil and tyrannical King George III. Thomas Paine referred to the British monarch as, quote, the hardened, sullen-tempered Pharaoh of England. And Elijah Fitch in 1776 preached, the means that our unnatural enemies have made us of, to bring and keep us under their power and control, are much the same, which Pharaoh, Egypt's haughty monarch, used, and they have as yet had the same effect. Their schemes to oppress, divide, and then subjugate these colonies have served to unite our hearts as one man, to cast off the burthens they have been imposing upon us. As the scholar James P. Bird notes, the third most cited biblical verse by preachers during this fight against the oppressive British was actually a quote from Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, which is recited daily in Jewish prayer. In that song, there is a verse that says, God is a man of war. God is a man of war. And preachers during the American Revolution took spiritual inspiration from that verse and used it to hype themselves up as they fought successfully, spoiler alert, against the British. And in fact, after a crucial battle, Washington, then General Washington, sat down, as I'm sure all soldiers do nowadays after a hard-fought victory. They loosen their buttons, they sit down, and they hear a nice, good sermon. And so he sat down and heard a sermon from one of his favorite preachers, and that preacher picked, Abiel Leonard, the chaplain, picked what passage to affirm the spiritual imprimatur behind the victory of General Washington and his soldiers. He discussed how the Egyptians were drowned after the splitting of the sea, through which, of course, the Israelites made it through dryly. And in fact, after another fight, a Reverend Israel Evans, note his first name, another one of Washington's favorites, he delivered a Thanksgiving sermon in which he compared the safety and success of this emerging nation to the Israelites standing at Sinai, where they received the Ten Commandments on the two tablets. And he recited the following poem in his sermon. To him who led in ancient days the Hebrew tribes, your anthems raise. The God who spoke from Sinai's hill protects his chosen people still. Seeing America as a new biblical Israel. Well, of course, every Pharaoh needs his Moses, and with all due humility, there were a few competing for the title. And so we have a letter to his beloved Abigail from John Adams, where he remarked, amazed at how he just heard a sermon in May of 1776 that featured, quote, a parallel between the case of Israel and that of America, and between the conduct of Pharaoh and that of George III. And he pondered his own potential role as America's Moses, saying, is it not a saying of Moses, who am I, that I should go in and out before this great people? Moses was on the minds of two other founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. They suggested, as a seal for the United States, this image rendered a few years later. Now, unlike anything, I'm sure, at Pepperdine, no great ideas ever die by committee. I assume that's correct, right, President Cash? So, unfortunately, this did die by committee, and this never became the symbol of America. But had it been, it would have been pretty awesome. Franklin had suggested Moses in the dress of a high priest standing on the shore and extending his hand over the sea, thereby causing the same to overwhelm Pharaoh, who is sitting in an open chariot. Whereas Jefferson chose the Israelites in the wilderness being led by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Instead, our symbol became actually almost antithetical. It was a pyramid with a creepy eye of Sauron or something on top of it. It's a waste. This would have been way cooler. After the American Revolution, of course, it was George Washington who was given the mantle of being America's Moses, so much so, in fact, that when he passed away, Pastor Eli Forbes, in a eulogy of Washington, now follow this along, in a eulogy of Washington, he said that biblical Moses, he was the Washington of Israel. Who's the icon there? Okay, Washington is being put on a pedestal of which Moses is then aspiring to be like. So beloved was Washington in the collective American imagination. Now, are there any Hebrew speakers here? Or anyone that can read Hebrew? Okay, I don't know if you can see Professor Halpern, but this is a prayer composed by a Jewish community in 1789. And this is from the synagogue records of a of a synagogue in Richmond, Virginia. This is a prayer Jews for many centuries have recited, a prayer for the safety and well-being of the government leadership in the countries in which we dwell. So this was a prayer for the safety and security that God should protect George Washington. So I don't know if you can see along the right-hand side, Professor Halpern, but there is a name spelled out in Hebrew letters along this way. It actually says, can anyone read it? Who reads Hebrew? It says Washington in Hebrew letters. So they literally wrote their love for George Washington into this Hebrew prayer. So grateful was the Jewish community for what he had done for all Americans. They wrote his name into the prayer. Theme number 3, I will redeem you. Not surprisingly, the story of freed slaves inspired those who were enslaved. And so those who were forced to pecan in the fields, the enslaved African Americans, sang spirituals with titles like Go Down Moses and Didn't Old Pharaoh Get Lost, aspiring to the freedom that had been achieved by biblical Israel. And Harriet Tubman's authorized biography appeared under the title Harriet Tubman, the Moses of her people. And in a fascinating address that I highly recommend reading when you get the chance, you can find it online, in an Independence Day talk by Frederick Douglass in 1852, he reminded Americans of their responsibility to ensure that all Americans were free by explicitly evoking the Jewish holiday of Passover, the holiday of liberation. And he said in his speech, and this was in front of the President of the United States who was in the audience, "This, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. This to you is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to the day and to the act of your great deliverance and to the signs and to the wonders associated with that act and that day." And he rebuked the Americans who dared to celebrate their freedom when not all Americans were free. It wasn't only non-Jewish Americans, of course, who saw their story as being like that of biblical Israel. It was Jewish Americans as well. In fact, there was a newspaper recounting how a Jewish Civil War soldier kept Passover with his fellow soldiers. And in this description, it reads as follows. Now, just by way of background, part of the ceremony, part of the dinner on Passover is not only do we drink 4 cups of wine, we also eat bitter herbs to remind ourselves of the bitterness of slavery. And so he wrote as follows, recapping what had happened. "We all had a large portion," he said in the Jewish Messenger in 1862, "a large portion of the maror, that bitter herb, ready to eat at the moment I said the blessing at the Passover Seder. Each ate his portion. When horrors, what a scene, ensued in our little congregation, it is impossible for my pen to describe. The herb was very bitter and very fiery, like cayenne pepper, and excited our thirst to such a degree that we forgot the law authorizing us to drink only 4 cups. And the consequences was we drank up all the cider. Those that drank the more freely became excited, and one thought he was Moses, another Aaron, Moses' brother, and one had the audacity to call himself Pharaoh. The consequence was a skirmish with nobody hurt, only Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh had to be carried from the camp." At the end of the story, he transitions from the humorous to the heavenly, and he concluded, "I doubt whether the spirits of our forefathers," said this private Joseph A. Joel, "had they been looking down on us, standing there with our arms by our side, ready for an attack, faithful to our God and our cause, would have imagined themselves amongst mortals, enacting this commemoration of the scene that transpired in Egypt." In other words, fighting for the North, powered by this story, he was literally risking his life for a more free America. Following the assassination of President Lincoln, who, as the preeminent American Jewish historian Jonathan Sarna of Brandeis University has noted, was actually killed on Passover, the great liberator was eulogized throughout the country as having been a Moses-like figure. So in a representative example, Reverend Rankin of Boston lamented, "In Abraham Lincoln, God gave us just the man to take us safely through the last stages of the rebellion. But the nation had now reached the Jordan, beyond which were sterner duties. We have passed the Red Sea and the wilderness, and have had unmistakable pledges that we shall occupy that land of union, liberty, and peace, which flows with milk and honey. Of course, paraphrasing the description of the land of Israel that the Bible gives as a land flowing with milk and honey. And as George Rabel points out in his excellent book, God's Almost Chosen Peoples, A Religious History of the Civil War, Moses and Lincoln had a few things in common. Like Moses, he writes, Lincoln had been born in humble circumstances and had to contend with a mighty slave power. Like Moses, Lincoln had been a great and good man with a special mission from the Lord. Like Moses, Lincoln had become the unlikely leader of a chosen people. Like Moses, Lincoln had come to the end of his journey and God had called him home. Like Moses, Lincoln had died at a most dramatic moment in his people's history. There was much talk across all levels of American society as Lincoln being America's new Moses after Washington. Now, of course, decades later, in the fight for civil rights, the story of the Exodus continued to inspire Americans. And in arguably his most famous speech, Martin Luther King Jr. on April 3rd gave a speech I'm sure we can all hear in our heads. You know, whenever Pharaoh wanted to prolong the period of slavery in Egypt, he had a favorite formula for doing it. What was that? He kept the slaves fighting among themselves, said Martin Luther King Jr. But, he continued, whenever the slaves get together, something happens in Pharaoh's court, and he cannot hold the slaves in slavery. When the slaves get together, that's the beginning of getting out of slavery. Now, he said, let us maintain unity. And he continued, this was the night before he was assassinated. I just want to do God's will, and he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. This story of the Exodus continued over the decades and over the centuries to be the moral language of liberty that powered the United States. Theme number 4, the call of the covenant. God's telling Moses to tell the people of Israel, I will take you as my people. So as we've seen throughout the American story, the Exodus has been there. And there's a very excellent book by Bruce Feiler, author of many popular histories, including, and also he filmed a PBS series called Walking the Bible, based on a book by the same name. He writes as follows in his book, America's Prophet. Americans consistently have pointed to the Exodus and Moses as their guiding inspiration. Moses, he says, is America's true founding father. Over a couple of years, Feiler traveled to some of the landmarks of American history, Independence Hall. We saw the Liberty Bell a few minutes ago. A way station on the Underground Railroad, the Statue of Liberty, among others, and he explored the way that Moses has been threaded and the Israelite story of the Exodus has been threaded throughout the story, and very importantly, across both sides of the political aisle. This has not been a partisan issue. In every generation, he wrote, from William Bradford through Barack Obama, who talked about the Moses generation of civil rights leaders, the Americans have seen Moses as their prophet, their leader. And I think, and this is particularly important in this moment of rising anti-Semitism in America post-Hamas's terrible attack on October 7th, this story is both an American story and it's a Jewish story. By that I mean, the upside of this story has been twofold. It has shaped America and it has helped America articulate its highest ideals of freedom and liberty. And it has also ensured that America, despite the current and unfortunate uptick in anti-Semitism, has been an incredible country for the American Jewish community, protecting our safety and security as it strives to protect that of all minorities in America. And that emerged because this story was shaped through a biblical lens. As he notes, Republicans use this story, Democrats use it, communists and capitalists use it, Jews and Christians use it. Well, it was Christians, of course, who made Moses a founding father, but we should all be grateful, or I as a Jew am very grateful, that this story has ensured that my ancestors have found safe haven in this country, forged as it was through a biblical lens. And so this story, which I trace a bit in this Passover Haggadah, and I threw a few covers of other books that I highly recommend that unpack this incredibly rich story of how the Bible has informed the American experiment, is a story that once, in brief, that emerged from the printing press, of course, and access people gained to the Bible in its original form. And they started reading it, and they started seeing, well, there's lots to say here about the nature of man and society and politics. And so, as Harvard's Professor Eric Nelson points out in his crucial book, The Hebrew Republic, the political philosophy that helped inspire the Founding Fathers and it helped shape our own emerged through this story of Christian Hebraists going back to the Bible, studying it, and first it shaped European political thought, as he traces in his book, and as others pointed out, including us at the Straus Center, where we actually launched this book, Proclaim Liberty Throughout the Land, the Hebrew Bible in the United States, a few years ago in this very room. So what we've seen today is how these four expressions of redemption that inspired the four cups that are drunk by Jews the world over on Passover night have also forged the freedom of America. I Will Bring You Out has been the story of survival, inspiring the Pilgrims and the Puritans and so many since. I Will Deliver You has inspired all those who continue to fight tyranny. I Will Redeem You has been a call of hope for those yearning to be free. And I Will Take You, for me as a people, is a continual challenge of Americans to think of themselves in covenantal terms, to think of this American project as something we're all in together, independent of our politics, as we aspire for fulfillment of America's highest ideals. And so maybe somewhat surprisingly, I want to end with the words of not an American, but a Brit, the late Chief Rabbi, Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. And he noted how, quote, cultures are shaped by the range of stories to which they give rise. Some of these have a special role in shaping the self-understanding of those who tell them. We call them master narratives. They are about large ongoing groups of people, the tribe, the nation, the civilization. They hold the group together horizontally across space and vertically across time, giving it a shared identity handed on across the generations. So what I think we've seen today is how this story has really unified America, and hopefully can and should be something that all Americans are reminded of, or they can learn it for the first time if they don't already know it. And as we seek, specifically in this time of election where it's so easy to think about how we're divided from each other, if we can remember what unites us and how the story of the Exodus has always united Americans, well, I think that's something that we can raise a glass to. Thank you very much.
As is our custom here on Constitution Day, we do have some time for Q&A. So any questions of Rabbi Dr. Halpern? Yes? Oh.
Thank you, and Yasher Koach is beautiful. Facing today, America seems to also face a new progressive Islamo-Marxist Maoist pharaoh. Do you look at President Trump as a Moses, a King David, an Ezra, or a Jeremiah?
I'm sticking to the unifying narrative here, so I think we can talk personal politics offline. But I appreciate the question.
Questions?
Please.
Yes, Ian.
Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. I'm thinking of the second part of Moses' story after he's led through the Exodus and the people of Israel not necessarily behaving the best and ending up in 40 years of wandering in the desert in penance. And I wonder if perhaps there's a corollary here that we should be aware of and think of and try and stay out of the desert, or are we in it?
So I think there's actually something like 400-page book on Jeremiads in American history, and I think the missteps over 40 years of the Israelites in the desert has definitely provided a model for America to have opportunities for national introspection. And I think absolutely, let's not pretend that the American experiment has always proceeded linearly and well. And I think we all have a lot of we have a great Hebrew phrase, cheshbon hanefesh, an accounting of the soul. I think we can also take this opportunity as we round the corner into the election to take an accounting of our collective soul, our individual souls, and make sure that whatever the next steps our country takes, it's something that we continue to maintain that sense of covenantal mutual responsibility for each other.
I'm looking at our students over here in the corner before I start calling them out.
Given that there's so much secularism today, how can we really spread the word and make it I mean, the secular people are not going to buy
Yeah.
into this, and that's been a huge part of the problem with the lessening of our values and
Yeah.
morality and everything else. And how
Yeah.
can we?
It's
How can we
I think we need to, well, you put it well, to spread the word. I think we need to combat biblical ignorance. And again, this is independent of politics. I think it's important to know whether one is a person of faith or just a student of history. You should appreciate the impact that the Bible has had. And my colleague, who Dean Peterson mentioned, Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik, who's the director of our Straus Center for Torah and Western Thought, likes to tell the story about how a major national newspaper once was recounting a speech given by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he mentioned the recounting of the reporter of the biblical allusion made by Netanyahu, per the reporter, was the time that Moses drew water from Iraq. Now, there was no Iraq in the time of the Bible. Moses drew water from a rock. He hit the rock and water came out. And yet, there was this ignorance on the part of a religion reporter in a major American newspaper who had no idea about Moses hitting the rock and just assumed he, smacked the ground in a country that didn't exist when he was alive. So I think it's important to, as best as we can, write about these themes and the reception history of the Bible and how it's been a positive force. And again, it hasn't always been a positive force, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, as Lincoln mentioned, both sides of the Civil War use the same Bible and pray to the same God. And so that's obviously something that the country has been reckoning with for many decades, and it's important to study that history as well. But I think we should, especially in educational institutions, do what we can to educate people about this crucial moral voice that has long played a role in the American story.
Yes, we've got a student.
Covenant is a very important agreement. It's a big commitment.
Big commitment.
And I'm wondering what you see as the difference between the covenant between God and the Jews in Israel versus the covenant that you seem to be expressing that he has with the United States.
So it's a great. So I briefly alluded to Lincoln referring to America as God's almost chosen people. So it's not my idea. It's his, in the sense that Americans, and really all of the Americans that we've looked at today, have sensed something special and something unique about America. And I think, frankly, as someone who actually currently lives in Israel and moved from this place called New Jersey, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it, 3 years ago, there's something special about the American-Israel relationship, because there's a sense in both countries since the beginning that there is a calling, and that these nations are not nations like any other, but are actually meant for a higher purpose. So I think, while of course that doesn't require people to prescribe to a certain faith necessarily, I think the value of feeling responsibility, that there's something special about what your nation can accomplish in the world, that's something that can continue in America and of course in Israel as well. Please.
Thank you. So another important influence on American thought is the Enlightenment. And I'm curious to what extent Enlightenment thinking was sort of in support of or sort of resonant with Jewish thought, or to what extent it was in tension with it, and whether there was, was it sort of a kind of American approach to just pulling in whatever might serve to purpose, or is there something more deeply resonant between those two strands?
So my particular interest lies more in the Hebrew Bible side, and I think it's important corrective to note that obviously the biblical voice is not the only voice in the American story, of course. And there are many influences, and the same scholar, Iran Shalev, whose book I put on a few slides ago, his wonderful book called American Zion, about the influence of the Bible in America, also has a book on the influence of Roman political thought on America. So there are a few voices that were inspiring, or the tapestry of the American story was woven with many threads. But my particular intellectual and professional interest lies in that of the Hebrew Bible. Thank you.
Thanks for coming out, and thanks for continuing to come out and be part of our community. And I think there's a special bond between Pepperdine and Yeshiva as well. My question relates to higher education,
Yes.
and really the secularization of higher education over the last couple hundred years, really more in the last probably 50 years. What role, if any, do you think faith-based higher education institutions can play in preserving this narrative, and then also the results of this bipartisan rooting in the Mosaic story?
Yeah, so I think, I believe you know my Uber boss, President Ari Berman, who's wonderful, and he is a firm believer in building the team. By that I mean, particularly as American Jews, there's essentially two ways of combating anti-Semitism. There's yelling louder than your enemies, or there's strengthening partnerships with your friends. So I think we all need to be in each other's corner, and we appreciate how much you guys have been in our corner, particularly in this moment. And so I think it's continuing to do things like this, collaborations and I'd love to bring students out here one day and host you at Yeshiva, and to just get to know each other and to see, well, who are people that ascribe by these values, and how can we build a better future together? And that's something that we're very passionate about institutionally and personally, of course. And so I think it's really just building the Avengers or the X-Men and women and whatever superhero analogy you want to evoke is more important now than ever. Thank you.
Yeah, following up on that, do you are you having a lot of Columbia University and other students transfer over to Yeshiva? I've understood like record numbers. And how do you accommodate them?
Yeah, we actually got a donation from Robert Kraft, who I don't know if you've heard of, but he owns the Patriots, and so he's a friend of Yeshiva, and so he actually gave us a designated gift to accommodate these folks who are switching from Cornell and Penn and Princeton and other places. And so, obviously, institutionally, we're glad to have them. I don't know necessarily that it's a mass exodus from Jews from other universities is necessarily good for America. I think it's important for there to be faith-based universities and for Jews to, frankly, be in all universities that they would get accepted into. But in this post-October 7th moment, we've definitely seen an uptick of interest, while at the same time, we know who our friends are. And we know who's supportive. And I want to mention, I think it was a few months ago that Pepperdine got a great shout out in the Wall Street Journal as being a place that's welcoming to Jewish Americans, and that's awesome. And so this is a pivotal moment in the American higher educational scene, and we appreciate those who have been, who appreciate us and who have been such kind and dear friends, and we welcome those who maybe don't feel that they're being dealt with in such a friendly way on their campuses.
Hi, my name is Amantra Edwards. I'm a first-year SPP student. So first of all, thank you for sharing your wisdom. I am interested in higher education and public policy. And so what wisdom would you give me as a first-year student who has a passion for both policy and kingdom principles? And so being able to be someone who is going back into low-income communities and spreading this knowledge and wisdom, what wisdom would you give me as I get ready to pave a new way for my community?
I mean, my wisdom would be we'd love to get to know you better at Yeshiva University. And I think I mentioned Rabbi Sachs before, who's a global leader. And he was friends with the global leaders of other faith communities. And I always say that at Yeshiva University, we'd love to connect the next Rabbi Sachs with the next Archbishop of Canterbury, who was a very close friend of his, when they're in college. And we'd love to get young women and men together just from the ground up, and as you start your graduate studies, to connect you with folks starting graduate studies at YU and really just build a better world together. I have no wisdom to give to you besides that. We appreciate you.
Yes.
So my question is back to when you're talking about Jewish students going back to yeshiva.
Yeah.
From your own personal perspective or biblical perspective,
Sure.
like I'm seeing all these things in the news happening right down in LA, where so many people are getting hurt.
Yeah.
What kind of advice would you recommend for us to be able to be supportive?
Wow. So I would say personal check-ins are always appreciated. Call, the text, the Facebook message. Are people still on Facebook? The DM on Twitter. And so, if you have Jewish friends who are going through a hard time, we're all basically been living every day is October 8th, essentially, for so many Jews around the globe. So I think to check in and those, so I would say in the personal level, it's so appreciated. The hug or the e-hug or whatever it is. And also just to be supportive, I think, through American principles. By that I mean more and more states and cities are now outlawing masks and, we're basically out of COVID. And so a lot of times you see folks at these rallies who are definitely not holding American flags, and they're definitely masked. And so thankfully, more and more legally, there have been ways of addressing the harsh treatment that many Jews are experiencing on campus, and hopefully that'll continue. But I would say a combination of those more formal policy moves, but never forget the personal, and it's always appreciated.
In the corner, we got time for two more.
Hello, first of all, thank you for being here. I'm a first-year SPP student. So my question is, when do you think that we should start emphasizing American history and American principles within education? Should we start elementary, high school? And it's just that's a big question. And also to considering the private versus public education, it's much easier to have this biblical tense in a private education.
Yes.
So how do we look at this also in the public setting?
It's great. So I'll work backwards. So Dean Peterson was kind enough to fly across the country to a conference we did. I think it was a couple marches ago with different educational leaders. And we actually had in our learning circle someone who works on designing classes on the Bible as literature in public schools. And he never makes a misstep because he says there's this, I guess, Pharaoh Ramses II is a nonprofit that will sue him anytime he does anything religious, and it's called, I think, Freedom from Faith. And so if he steps over the line, they're gonna whack him like Moses whacked Iraq. And so he's working on ways to legally get this stuff into the public school system, which of course is more challenging. But I would say in terms of when, so I personally, through a great organization, it's a bit of a partner organization for us at Yeshiva, a place called the Tikva Fund, I teach on Sundays to 11 and 12-year-olds about the material that we went over today, obviously on a lower level, but it's something that, and it's hard to believe because I have an 11-year-old and I haven't yet taught him, and he's more interested in the Yankees, and that's probably my fault, but there are 11 and 12-year-olds, even if it's not mine, who are interested in sitting down and learning about American history and about the Bible, and I've seen it in action with our friends over there, and so I would ballpark it at around that age or so.
One more question.
Please.
Hi. So I know you mentioned collectively that we should not harm, Jewish students, of course, and like being Iraqi and like it's just like I'm trying to understand what the whole country has to do with, different perspectives, because I think about the people there, I think about my family out there, but I want to know what kind of is the connection with Iraq. So.
Currently I don't think that there's a meaning in terms of contemporary Israel and Iraq.
Like in general.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. So I was referencing a joke before that it happened. So it's not a joke, but there was a journalist who wasn't aware that there's a story in the Bible about how Moses hit a rock to draw water from it for the Israelites who were wandering in the desert for 40 years, and a journalist thought that Moses had hit Iraq because he misheard the reference from Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I apologize for not being clear about that.
No worries.
Please join me in thanking Rabbi. We're going to hang out for a little bit. Before we wrap up, I wanted to really appreciate a few people here. I've learned from our team that we had at least a dozen, if not more people here who did not register. Now, the reason that is important is because one of the ways to answer some of the questions about what do we do with this amazing presentation that we have been blessed with, how do we promote that, spread that? Well, that's a video camera right there, and we just videotaped this whole thing. So everyone who registered, we will send a link to the video that we post on SPP's YouTube page. I think it's so important to spread messages like this within your own networks. There might be 70 people here in this room, but if you look at your own personal networks, I'm sure there are hundreds, if not thousands of people who would really enjoy hearing Dr. Halpern's message because it's just such an important message for today. And so if you haven't registered, please make sure that we get your email address. And again, within the next couple days, we'll be sending you around a link to the video. A couple people I want to really appreciate. First, the president of Pepperdine University is here, President Jim Gash. Jim, I want to thank you. We also have a couple of our great SPP faculty here. Dr. Jim Prieger was here. Dr. Luisa Blanco is here. I think especially for some of you Seaver students, it's great to see so many of you here today. If you want to learn a little bit more of the program, about the program, please feel free to speak with Dr. Blanco or certainly myself. I also want to thank Professor Pendergraph as well for bringing your class. It's great to have you up here at Drescher, and very grateful for you and your partnership. I also want to make sure that I thank the person that made this introduction between SPP and the Straus Center, and that's Michael Halpern at the law school. Michael is not only a good friend of SPP's, he's a good friend of mine. And Michael, I'm just so grateful for your vision in making this initial connection, which not only continues, but I'm so excited to see where it goes from here as we build this relationship really on the underpinnings of Judeo-Christian thought and its importance here at the School of Public Policy and certainly at Pepperdine University more broadly. So with that, again, welcome to hang out. We've got some cookies over there. We've got other food here. I would also again commend, if you get a moment, to take a walk over to the Heroes Garden, especially on 9/11. It's an important journey to make. So again, thanks so much.